Well, welcome, everybody, to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And that means, of course, as always, some smart talk radio is in your future, and this segment no exception. A fascinating story about World War II. The work is called A Death in San Pietro. It's the untold story of Ernie Pyle, John Huston, and the fight for the Purple Heart Valley by Tim Brady. Tim is an award-winning author. He's a regular contributor to PBS. He also writes for the History Channel magazine, Minnesota Monthly, and more and more and more. Also a prolific author of some other works we'll talk about later. But let's get started here. Tim, how are you, my friend?
I'm very good.
We commented off the air on the weather. You're up in the friendly confines of St. Paul, Minnesota. It's a little bit chilly up there too, I would think.
It's beyond chilly. It's freezing.
Well, the work, A Death in San Pietro, it is a really, really interesting story, a short time, but about World War II. Let's give our Lewis at Large listeners here a little bit of a setup and talk about the primary characters here and what the work is really all about.
Well, A Death in San Pietro is the story of three men in a small battle in Italy. Ernie Pyle was the most famed war correspondent in World War II. John Huston was a young filmmaker on the rise, a Hollywood figure. And the last character is a man named Captain Henry Waskow, who was just a highly regarded but relatively anonymous captain in the what was called the Texas Division, the 36th Division, and the 36th Division arrived in Italy in the fall of 1943, fought its way up the Italian peninsula, and finally came to a little village called San Pietro, and there fought a very, very tough battle with the Germans.
And it's just literally, as they say, the fickle finger of fate that brought them together.
It is. Pyle, of course, was covering the war, and he had been in North Africa and followed the troops up to Sicily and into Italy as well. Huston arrived in Italy from England, and Waskow was, of course, soldiering the whole way, and they came to a halt at this village, and it was there that the battle was fought.
Before we go too much deeper into this particular story, I'm curious. You've done a lot of writing, a lot of research, particularly related to American history and military in particular. What was it about this story? First of all, what brought this story to your attention, and why this story over so many others?
I had done a book that came out a year and a half ago called 12 Desperate Miles, which was the story of the American invasion of Morocco and North Africa in the fall of 1942. It was really the first action in America of U.S. troops in the war in what became the European theater. The book was about the role of a ship that was that was drafted into service and employed by General Patton and others for this invasion. In the course of doing that story, I discovered that Walter Cronkite was a war correspondent during that battle, and I got interested in the story of war correspondents in general during World War II, and that, of course, led me to Ernie Pyle. And when I started looking deeply into Ernie Pyle's life, I discovered that his most famous column involved this small battle in Italy, and I was hooked, and I started to look into it, and it seemed like a book to me.
Sticking on the subject of war correspondence, today's war correspondent has some kind of a cell phone or something slightly more sophisticated and uploads some kind of virtual report. Ernie Pyle didn't have that luxury. What, from your perspective and the research that you've done and just your personal opinion, what did Ernie Pyle have to do to distinguish himself, and why was he so special amongst legions of others, and where would he fit today?
That's a very good question. I think that he would still remain an outstanding correspondent. He came to World War II from long years as a columnist. He had started out in D.C. and started working for the Scripps Howard newspaper chain. And sometime in the mid-30s, he became sort of an on-the-road correspondent in the sort of Charles Kuralt vein. He traveled across the country with his wife and just wrote features about everyday people he met. When the war began, he traveled to England and decided, with the blessings of Scripps Howard and his editor there, to sort of do a column, as he put it, based on the same sort of thing that I've been doing in the States, meaning that he would travel with the troops and write about ordinary people. And Pyle was a very slight man, an unassuming man, and he was able to ingratiate himself to virtually everyone he met during the war. And he wrote about everyday things. He wrote about the troops as they bivouacked, as they talked in the evening, he described how they shaved, he described how they ate, he described how they lived. And this was the sort of things that these were the sort of things that folks back home wanted to know about the troops, about the GIs. So he was just he was in every respect an ordinary man, except for the fact that he was a great writer and a great reporter.
Again, if you just joined us, here's truly Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. Smart Talk Radio, indeed. Here we're talking about a work called A Death in San Pietro, the untold story of Ernie Pyle, John Huston, and the fight for Purple Heart Valley. Our guest is Tim Brady, award-winning author, a regular contributor to PBS, is also a writer for the History Channel magazine, et cetera, et cetera. Tim, let's talk about John Huston. Tell us about what his sort of why is he there, and from your perspective, what did he take away from his experiences in World War II?
Another good question. Huston was there because he was a great filmmaker, and he had volunteered for the service soon after the war began, and he had come to the Signal Corps by way of Hollywood, where he was a young director on the rise. He just completed Maltese Falcon, the famous Humphrey Bogart movie, and he was making another movie when he got called to service by the Signal Corps, went up to Alaska to shoot a documentary, and was in England with Frank Capra, the other famed filmmaker, and they were working on a documentary about North Africa when word came from the highest level of the Allied command, the U.S. command actually, that they wanted a documentary film made of the Italian campaign, but they didn't want the sort of propaganda film that had been made earlier in the war. They didn't want a film that was going to promote the war, but one that was going to show the hard slog that was involved in the war. And part of this was to help people understand back home, and the soldiers themselves who would be seeing this film, that there were at least 2 more years of fighting to come, and people had to understand that what was going on in Italy was a hard battle. Huston got tapped to do this, and he went off to Italy and started to film as soon as he arrived there.
As a writer, I'm curious, when you look at this group of 3 people, were these, as a writer, could you have handpicked a better 3?
they were made good contrast. Let me put it that way. Pyle was unassuming, an Indiana boy who was always kind of lurking in the background and ingratiating himself and just being unassuming. Houston was a Hollywood guy. He arrived in the Italian campaign wearing smoke aviator glasses, like some sort of Hollywood star, and Wasco was just he was just a quiet kid from Texas. He was 25 years old, well liked. He'd been promoted to a captaincy while still in the States, and was very proud of the fact that he was in charge of a couple hundred men in an infantry company in Italy.
Well, let's do this. Let's dive now into sort of the meat of the book itself. Take us there, describe what happens, and let's go from there.
Well, the story is the story of the Italian campaign, which began with the invasion of Salerno in the early part of September. Wasco was part of that. The Salerno was a hard fight, but the city and the nearby peninsula were taken in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks, and the campaign started to move up towards Rome. Rome was the ultimate destination initially, and what happened was the American army started to move up the Italian peninsula, and they found it very hard going after the initial battle. They ran into Italian geography. The mountains of Italy ran smack dab across the center of the peninsula, and the Germans had made a very tough, what they called the Winter Line, which was actually a series of defenses in the mountains across central Italy. And by the end of November and in early December, the Americans had hit the full force of the German line which was centered around a village called San Pietro. And Wasco was, of course, part of that action. Pyle had been following the troops, and he was observing. Houston arrived with his cameras and would be filming the action.
Do you think, I'm curious as to the attitude of the military at the time of having the media there, and I'm wondering if it would differ now.
Interesting. One of the things that I was curious about was the relationship between the media and the Army and the command during World War II. And one thing that I found very interesting was the fact that because of this bottleneck in Italy, because of the geography and the stalling of the campaign, there was an all-star contingent of correspondents who were all gathered around the midsection of Italy, watching and waiting for the U.S. Army to break through and head off to Rome. There was a closeness, which is similar, I suppose, to correspondents who are embedded or were embedded during recent wars. But there was also Italy was a glamorous region. Naples was just down the road. The Isle of Capri was just down the road. There was there were contingents of USO performers. Humphrey Bogart himself arrived in Naples late in the campaign. Irving Berlin was in Naples after it was taken, and so the correspondents would head to Naples for relief, and they were staying in this magnificent palace in Caserta, Italy, which was the headquarters of Commander Mark Clark. So there was quite a bit of glamour that hung out around the battlefield too, which struck me as an interesting detail.
There was glamour. There was also World War II, as we all know, in many ways romanticized and maybe overly so. Would you agree with that, or?
Oh yes, and but one thing that I found interesting too was the use of public relations in the war. I found it interesting that by this stage in the war, George Marshall and FDR himself both thought that it was necessary they were the force behind this edict to make documentary films and presentations that we were going to display the hardness of the war and the toughness of the fighting. They were. It was interesting to me that sensibility existed, that there was a sophistication to the PR that I hadn't quite realized before I looked into the subject.
Well, let's continue on here with the story. You've done a nice setup for us here, but.
Well, what happened was then, as the various forces gathered around San Pietro, I should mention, was built at the base of a 4,000-foot high mountain called Mount Samucro. The attack of San Pietro, which was sat up above what was dubbed Purple Heart Valley. It was actually called the Liri Valley in Italy. The Liri Valley was the highway to Rome. It was basically the way to Rome. San Pietro was just above it. Mount Samucro loomed high, 4,000 feet above the valley. To take Liri Valley, it was necessary to take Mount Samucro, and Wascow's company was a part of a battalion that headed up the mountain in the second week of December to do just that. They ran into tough German resistance, and as I mentioned, the German winter line was a combination of rocky redoubts and on the mountainside and pillboxes down in the valleys, and the Germans had basically 2 months to reinforce this part of the battlefield. So the American army was thrust against some formidable defenses, and they suffered from it. And it took a full 2 weeks to finally bust through the German defenses and move on up the valley to actually what would be a series of more tough fights on the way to Rome.
So take us towards the end.
Well, Henry Wascow was killed by shrapnel on the mountain. I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying that. He was killed about mid-December, stayed up on the mountain for 3 days as the fighting continued, and then was taken down the mountain on the back of a mule. Ernie Pyle was at the base of the mountain, just observing the battle and observing the goings-on. Henry Wascow came down the hill, and Pyle noted he had not met Wascow. They didn't know one another, but Pyle saw him coming down the hill, and noticed that his company down below was deeply moved by the depth of Wascow. And Pyle basically recorded that moment that Wascow came down and was taken off the mule. He noted Wascow's men coming up, doing things like straightening his lapels, shaking their heads, doing this sort of deeply moving kind of acknowledgments and respect for this man. And Pyle wrote just a beautiful, touching column that described that scene. That column was picked up by Scripps Howard, and by the end of December and early January, it was reprinted in hundreds of publications across the U.S., and it sort of captured the moment in a way that few writings did during the war. And it became, as I said, probably the most celebrated single column of the war, both for Pyle and probably for every other correspondent in the country.
What again? You're a writer, and so you distance yourself. You weren't there, but undoubtedly, doing this research, these people become terribly real to you. What kind of, as an author and as an observer, decades later, what's your takeaway from all this?
To me, it's just a powerful story of war. My father was a vet, a World War II vet, and I was one of the reasons I was attracted to Pyle and I was attracted to Wasco is that my experience with my father served in the Navy, and I would attend some World War II reunions with him and his shipmates, and I was struck by how normal they were, how 40 years after the fact, they were sort of these prototypical U.S. seamen, in this case, type, from different parts of the country, from Brooklyn and from Maine and from Wisconsin and from the South and from Kansas and California, but they were all just regular guys, and part of the reason that I was drawn to the story of Pyle and Wasco is how regular they were and how that was what they stood for, and they were thrust into these extraordinary circumstances, and sometimes under heroic circumstances, sometimes under tragic circumstances.
Right. Each story, we have interviewed over the years several authors and reporters about works they've done about particular events, in particular World War II. And I'm curious as to your opinion. There was a lot of writing about World War II during World War II, obviously, and right after. But there seems to be a new proliferation of works coming out by the baby boom generation, as they say, about the greatest generation, of which this is yet another story. I'm curious as to your take as to why that is. I think I've got an opinion of my own, but I'd like to hear yours.
Well, I think I probably just outlined it. I think that people like myself, whose fathers were in the service in World War II, are coming to look at that service in a different light. And when I grew up with my father, I grew up sort of immersed in his service and the war, but I wasn't that deeply curious about it. He passed about a dozen years ago, and I think that really triggered a deeper interest in me in what happened and how he served there. And again, I'm struck by the fact that these were by and large very young men, and they were in a gigantic war, huge numbers of volunteers and draftees thrust into service, and just how they did it, how they came out of it. It's all of great interest to me, and I think it is to people of my generation.
Interesting also, the celebrity, always well known as a writer, but Ernie Pyle, wow, did he come out of there a hero in his own right, did he not?
I think he did. I think that a lot of people admire him.
I noticed it in your work, and I remember he landed, didn't he, a cigarette endorsement contract from Camel?
Chesterfield.
Or Chesterfield, rather, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I knew it was one of the unfiltered brands.
Yeah. I was, it was interesting. He got that contract, but there was another detail that I think he usually rolled his own, but Chesterfield, I think, was trying to get him to get on the bandwagon.
Well, again, the work is called A Death in San Pietro, the untold story of Ernie Pyle, John Huston, and the fight for Purple Heart Valley. The author is a journalist, historian, and author in his own right, Tim Brady. Hey, Tim, probably pretty obvious, but how can people get a copy of the work and also find out maybe a little bit more about the other works you've done?
Well, you can visit deathinsanpietro.com to find out a little bit more about this book. My first book, 12 Desperate Miles, is you can find it at Amazon.com, at Barnes & Noble. It's bookstores everywhere. Both books are in bookstores everywhere.
Tim, I know you're in the throes of promoting this thing, but what's next for you?
I think I'm going to do another World War II book. I haven't finalized the subject, but I've done the North African campaign, I've done the Italian campaign, and I think I'm going to do something near the end of the war in Europe.
Al, I really appreciate your insights. The work is a fascinating one, indeed, a tremendous story, and thanks so much for spending part of your day with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I really appreciate you having me on.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.